So to complete our rain setup, we are going to add the ability for the particles to leave wetness on a surface, and we do that using wet maps. Now, wet maps are a way of transferring shading to a surface when a particle comes into proximity or within a range set in a wetness tag or wet map tag. It will actually leave value on the surface. So it basically means that you can mark a surface with a particle. It doesn't have to be a liquid. It's called a wet map, which obviously you think of a liquid when it does that, but that's just the easiest way to describe it. It could be used for all sorts of other things, like say you've got an afterburner or a jet engine or something, and you leave a burn mark on a wall or on the ground. You could use a wet map to do that, for instance. So we're going to need some wet maps tags, and we're going to have a look at how they transfer the shading to the objects. Okay, so I've broken out this demo scene to show off wet maps and how they work. We need a few things, and if I press play, we can just see what's going on. We have an emitter, a gravity modifier, and a collision surface, which is just a 2-polygon L-shaped surface for them to bounce around on and make contact with. And what we're going to need for our wet map is we're going to need the object, which we've got here, the source particles, and an XP wet map tag. So I'm going to add that now. If I just pause and go back to the beginning, right click our object, go to X particles tags, and it's down here under XP wet map. So we add that there. And the wet maps isn't built into the collider tag because it doesn't have to have a collider for the wet map to work. You know, you could have particles moving through a surface and still leave a mark. So that's why it's a separate tag. And we need to do a couple of things. First of all, we need to add our particles as one of the sources for our wet map. So I'm going to drag our particles in. I'm going to go back up here. I'm also going to turn off render only, because render only means that the map will only be generated on render time. And that means we can't quickly review it in the viewport. And when it says render time, it means going to the picture viewer. So if I turn that off so that it's ready, and if I press play now, our wet map will be generating stuff, but there's no way to display it. Now there's a few ways to display it. One is with a vertex map, and one is with the XP wet map shader, which is what I'm going to introduce you to first. So if I create a material, I can just double click in the material editor there. Oh, sorry, in the material window. And if I go to the texture channel that I want to put the wet map into in the color channel, go down to X particles, and we see here we have wet map shader. I'll add that, go into it, and we need to assign the object and the wet map tag. So we can do that, we know what they are. So it's the object, is the polygon object there, and then the wet map tag I can just drag back in as well. So okay, something happened in the preview, but never ever trust the preview with the wet map shader. It doesn't really accurately represent things, although that's not too far off, you'll see in a second. I'll apply our material and I'll render and see what we get, which is showing pretty much in the viewport. So something weird is showing. Something's happened, and it is actually responding to the particles. So like I said, ignore the texture on the surface. I'll have to render. In fact, if I put an IRR up, which is an interactive render region, which is Alt-R, we can see the wet map gets updated. So the particles have only just hit there. We see now they're hitting the floor, and they are adding value to where they collide. However, it's incredibly low resolution. And this is actually a vertex. So this is actually, the particles are near here, and they are adding wetness, but then the mesh is so low density that there are not enough subdivisions for it to add to any more vertices. So there's two ways of fixing that, obviously. You could, if I turn the interactive render region off, I could subdivide the mesh, which I would recommend. That's probably the best way to do it. Or we can increase the resolution in the wet map tag. So the resolution is defaulting to 2, which means we get 2 sets of subdivisions. So that's 1 subdivision and then 2 subdivisions. And then you can actually kind of see that these, you can actually see that these dots are actually sitting on those division lines. But we need to increase it to make the map look smoother. So let's just go up one at a time, and I'll keep playback going, and we should see some more density occurring. So there we go, we're getting a bit more. Let's jump to 6. 6 is a pretty smooth value, I believe. Okay, it takes some time, by the way, because we're actually subdividing the geometry significantly. And there you go. We're getting a smooth wet map where the particles are hitting more, where more hit the surface. It's getting more wet, and they slide around and they're leaving a mark on the surface. That's really cool. So, and we can tweak some of these settings. So we can go into the wet map shader, and we can change the sample radius. Sample radius you can think of as a smoothing parameter. So the lower this is, the sharper it'll get, but then you'll get to a point where it'll be below a threshold. Oops, I don't render that. There we go. You can see it's much finer and more detailed. So if you need more detail in your map, I'm going to leave it at the default of 25 because it's nice and smooth. There we go. It's a bit more like a wet map. You know, we don't want too much detail depending on what setup you have. But for our rain setup, we don't need too much. But the issue that you're seeing here is that I'm having to render every time. Every time I need to see changes to our wet map, I'm having to render. And especially, and when I go up to a high resolution, like if I play back now, the playback will become incredibly slow. And also, if I render now, it'll also be very slow. So you can see it's getting caught on this wet map. So we need to make this a bit lighter on the system. And the best way to do it is to actually subdivide the geometry and then only use a low resolution in the tag. So I'm going to use a resolution of 1 in the tag, and I'm actually going to subdivide our geometry. So I'm going to do that now. I'm going to go U and S, and I'm going to subdivide it by 5 or 6 times. Let's go for 6. And there you go. We get a much denser mesh. Now, obviously that's not practical in all scenes. You might end up with crazy high-res geometry or just too much of it. So it depends. You might be using the resolution in the tag or being able to subdivide into the actual geometry itself. So because we've got simple surfaces here, we can subdivide them. And I go back into our tag and I play again. And I render. And we can see we are still getting a smooth looking wet map, but it was much quicker. It was significantly quicker. If I just up the resolution a touch, it's still pretty quick, but we'll get more resolution. In fact, I need to reduce the, there we go. So we can still get detail and it's much, much quicker. So that's one way of reviewing things is to play back the viewport and then render and then check it and keep going back and forth. However, if you want to see a bit more of a real-time demonstration of your wet map, you need to use vertex maps. And because you can see here, I mean, this is an ugly viewport representation. It can't display it correctly. So we need to add a vertex map. So if I close our material down, I'm going to actually delete our material because we don't need that anymore. Go to our wet map tag, and we see that we have this vertex map out field, link field. So we need to add a vertex map. So if I go into polygon mode or point mode or edge mode, and we go to set vertex weight, it doesn't matter. We could put it at whatever percentage we like. It will be overridden by the tag. So if I drag that over to here, go back to our wet map tag and drag this vertex map into the vertex map out field. And if I select it, I'm going to go back to object mode. I'm going to get rid of the wireframe. I press play, you saw it goes red, and there we go. We get a real-time preview of our vertex map being generated. And this is really useful because when you're editing your wet map, you might want to be changing parameters and just letting the playback loop. So I'm going to actually click on our wet map tag, and you notice that the viewport display goes back to not showing the vertex map, which is not very useful. So what I tend to do is I tend to break out an extra attributes manager for our wet map tag. So whilst you're on the wet map tag, come down to the attributes manager, and you can hit this add button, and it'll open up a attributes manager for the wet maps tag. And this lock icon means that even if I click onto other things, it'll stay on the wet map. So that's cool. I'm going to go back and click on our vertex map, which is being output. And now I can start messing with these parameters here. So first off is distance. Now distance is pretty obvious. You can see even before they come into contact with the surface, they're generating a large radius around them. So that's like if the particle was carrying a lot of liquid, perhaps it would do that. But we tend to want it fairly fine, so it's fairly subtle like this, and it stays in pretty tight to the particle. That looks pretty cool. Wetness is So when the particle hits the surface, you'll see that it takes a couple of hits for it to actually reach fully 100% this yellow color. We can increase the wetness value to 100%. So immediately, as soon as they hit, it's applying 100% value. Or conversely, a really low value. Let's go for 4%. And you can see it takes a while for the surface to actually get really wet. And that's good for fading things on. You know, say it's our rain setup. You know, the first drop isn't going to make the surface fully wet. It might take a few drops. So, you know, we might, and especially when you've got splash particles coming in, because there's loads of them, you know, you don't want them all to suddenly just make the map 100% wet. You want them to kind of fade it on nicely. Okay, cool. Fade. Now, fade is a value where once it's applied the value, it'll fade over a time. And if I increase that to like a really high value, actually, it's a bit hard to see. If I just do a shot emission, if I go to our emission tab, change it to shot mode, that means that I'm only going to shoot a set of particles out at the time I say for a duration, like that. So you can see I've just dropped it on, like smashed it against the wall, and then they disappear. However, you can see if I increase the fade value, so they make contact and then it fades away. So increase the wetness as well. There we go, fades away. Pretty cool. Now, that's obviously unrealistic in terms of drying speed. You know, it wouldn't dry that quickly, but it might absorb into the surface, so you never know. That might be, say this was a fabric and the liquid sort of absorbs in and then it looks just like it did before. Pretty cool. So all these parameters you can mess around with, you know, for as much as you like, and you end up with a really cool wet map system. Spread distance, we don't need to worry about that too much right now, but that's a way that you can get it to leak into the surface and spread around. And then we have our vertex map stuff as well. We've already dealt with the vertex map output, but we can also change how detailed the vertex map is sampled. And that's similar to the sampling size in the wet map shader. So if I go back into that, click on that, it's simple to this it's similar to this sample radius. So if I go to 10, we start to get a smoother look, but if I go too low, we'll actually get a very sharp, pixelated, blocky look. So you want to keep that above the polygon size, or roughly above the polygon size, and there we go. That's kind of a nice. Go back to 15. There we go. So that's it for wet maps, and we'll jump back into our rain scene and apply this technique to our rain. Okay. Back in our main rain scene, we can now start applying some of that knowledge we learned about wet maps to this scene. So we've got our collision object. Obviously, we've got this connect going on, and it's combined our scene geometry. But we also need a wet map tag, and also the source particles assigned to that wet map tag. Okay, so first off, let's have a look at the geometry that we've got going on here. And to keep the performance good with this many particles, we're going to need to find a balance between the density of the collision objects and the number of particles. So I'm noticing that we're not actually getting any collisions on some parts of this plane, so we don't actually need it to be that big. If I just move it over here, scale it down, something like this, just so that it's keeping everything efficient. And then we're going to subdivide it a little bit. So if we perhaps increase this sphere a bit, so it's something like that, maybe 60 by 60, just so that the polygons are roughly the same size. Maybe I need to go a bit higher actually. And maybe the torus, double that up. Maybe increase it some more around this way. A bit more around that way. There we go. Okay, so that's our collision geometry, and this will slow things down because we are going to get a slower playback, but it's not too bad, and we can still see the collisions nice and clean. And now we need to make this editable. So instead of making each of them editable and adding a wet map tag to each, we're going to make this this top connect object editable. Well, actually, we won't make it editable because we'll lose the collision tag. So if I press C, you see that we lost the collision tag there. We actually need to do a right-click current state to object, and then I can just drag the tag onto it. And I can hide our original parametric objects if we want to keep them for later. And we can just call this collision surface. There we go. And now we can start looking at the wet map stuff. So I'm going to right click, go to XParticles tags, add the XP wet map. I'm just going to drag it to the end there. I like to just put them all in the same sort of place. I'm going to add a vertex map. So if I set the vertex weight, it'll automatically add us a tag for us. So set vertex weight. You have to be in polygons, points, or edges mode. I add it. Doesn't matter about the percentage because it gets set by the tag itself. Go into the tag. First things first, when we're developing the wet map, turn off render only. Drag in the vertex map out into the vertex map out section. And that should be ready to go now. Apart from one thing before I forget, we need to set the emitter as a source. So I can choose either the rain, the splashes, or both emitters to generate our wet map. For this scenario, because the rain particle actually only comes into contact with the surface and then generates the particles, the splash particles, we can just use those because they're still close to the surface. So I'm going to actually drag just the splashes into the particles field, and I can reduce that down so it fits nicely in the attributes manager. Click away, click onto our vertex map. Just right click by accident there. Press play. Playback is definitely slower again. However, we're going to see a wet map being generated. There we go. So that's really cool. We're getting this nice surface being filled with the wetness where the water's hitting. And if I go here, I can reduce the wetness value right down. I could perhaps increase the sample size so it's a bit smoother. The reason I'm dropping the wetness right down is that for every particle that collides, we have 10 being generated. So I need to click on there we go. So it's getting a bit heavy. It's applying too much wetness all at once. And there we go. So we're getting a nice wet map generated by our rain. And that's really it for the wet map section and for our rain setup. We can now save this as a preset, and we could reuse this in any scene that we wanted. So say I'm happy with this setup, I can get rid of our parametric objects, and that's cleared from our scene. And what I can do is I can actually save this as a system preset. So if I rename this and I call it GSG XP rain, there we go. And I can actually save this as a system preset. And I have a bunch of presets that I've already created. So I'll click on save as system preset, and we can see we've already got a bunch of system setups and presets here, which is pretty cool. But I'm going to add this one as GSG XP rain. There we go. And I could give it a description if I wanted, and I can press OK. Now, if I jump into a new scene, we'll see what happens. So if I Control N, Command N to create a new scene, I add a system. And now if I go to load system preset, I just have to find our preset, and there we go, GSG XP rain. Press OK, and it throws in our setup exactly as it was in the other scene. And if I press play, we'll get exactly the same things going on. And we'll see our wet map is generating as well. So, and we could use this as a base. So we could strip that collision. Obviously, you're not going to want the same collision geometry in the scene. You're going to want to change it out. And you can just drag these tags onto the new object. And as long as you, if there's any reference to this collision object, say it was in the wet map shader, you'd have to reassign that. But that's the only thing you'd have to do. And so this is really powerful as well, having these presets and being able to save things like this, because once you've done some things once, you never need to recreate them. You'll only need to tweak them. So and it might just be a good way to start another setup as well. So it's cool. Okay, and that wraps up our rain setup.